Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And I am really enjoying this conference, and I want also to say that I really liked some of the presentations of the students that I have seen. I have seen some presentations with very good methodology as well, so I want to congratulate the students presenters and also my colleagues who have been presenting before me. I really enjoyed this presentation, and we have some similar notes. So I was asked to talk about cross-border cooperation. Well, actually, I will provide a few examples from different countries of the similarities and differences in the challenges that we face, because, of course, this is an international conference, but not only this, because the similarities are are the basis that allow us to cooperate. So, cooperation means many different things. And I will look at high-level cooperation, so states, governments, but especially civil society cooperation. And what is the civil society? It's like people like us, academics, researchers. So let's start with the challenges. In the title I was given, there are terrorism and organized crime, which I definitely agree. They are two key challenges. But we don't have to understand them, terrorism and organized crime, as different threats. They actually have a lot of overlap. So we heard in the presentation about, for example, cases from South America, I think, John, we're mentioning it. Yes, so in South America there are very interesting cases of groups that are kind of both criminal and terrorists. And we see the same also in Southeast Asia. Let's think about Abu Sayyaf. So cases when the political goals of terrorist groups overlaps with criminal and financial goals of organized crime. So we see when groups start doing on a large scale, for example, drug trafficking or kidnapping for ransom. So these types of examples tell us that there is an overlap between terrorism and organized crime that we have to acknowledge. But not only this. So one of my points in this presentation is that we often look at the tip of the iceberg, so terrorism. Serious crime. But we cannot only understand this phenomenon by looking at the most serious cases. So what, for example, scholars looking at extremism or, for example, hate crime, which I will talk in a minute in my presentation, try to look at less serious cases of, for example, violence against outgroups, and try to understand the relationship potential, and we don't know much about it, but we have some anecdotal evidence that there is a relationship between less serious incidents of violence, for example, and more serious ones. Hateful extremism is an interesting concept that has emerged in recent years. But only, I would say, in the last maybe 8 months, it has really got some traction. So 3 weeks ago, the UK Government Commission for Countering Extremism has released a report in which they define hateful extremism as behaviors that can incite and amplify hate, engage in persistent hatred, or equivocate about and make the moral case for violence. So it's not only inciting violence, it's equivocate about violence and make the moral case about violence. So it reminds me, for example, Raj's presentation about Malaysia and organized or institutionalized extremism. So start looking at broader concepts like hateful extremism reminds us that we need to look at less serious incidents and the potential association between hatred and extremist violence. I give you a couple of examples, anecdotal cases in which we have seen it. So for example, in Sri Lanka, you might remember the Easter attacks, the attackers were engaged in serious cases of hate speech, and everyone knew in Sri Lanka. But they also engaged in behavioral violence, so they vandalized Buddhist shrines. So no one really picked up these incidents before then, but after the case. So the question is there a relationship between less serious incidents and more serious incidents? The Christchurch attacker, Brenton Tarrant, used as well to engage in hate speech in social media. Actually, a person reported him before the attack to Victoria Police in Australia because he made death threats on Facebook. Well, no one picked up this incident, but then he went on to commit the Christchurch attack. So again, is there a relationship between the two? Another important concept is hate crime. I was discussing with Titian before. In Indonesia, actually, there is not a lot of focus or even understanding in legislation about hate crime. Hate crimes are crimes, any type of crime, in which the offender is at least partially motivated by bias or prejudice against a group, against a identity. So for example, aggression towards Muslim people in Australia are called acts of Islamophobia, and they are hate crimes because people use violence or make threats against Muslims because of what they represent, because of their identity, because they are Muslims, not because they hate the specific person that they are attacking. And in Indonesia we see a lot of this, for example, against Shia, against Ahmadiyya, for example. So it's similar. There are hate crimes, crimes committed because of hate and prejudice. I'm happy to talk more about this concept in the Q&A if you want, but there are many similarities, and this is a recent work I have done with my colleagues at Deakin. There are similarities between hate crime and terrorism. Similarities are that they target mostly civilian population, that they have socio-political goals, at least in how biases reflect ideas about society. For example, attacking a person because he's Ahmadiyya reflects an idea about Ahmadiyya's position in society. And this is sort of an ideology or a quasi-political ideology. There are differences, of course. Hate crimes not always involve violence. Terrorism, yes. Different levels, even though not always of planning and resources. But there are very interesting similarities. Again, my point is, when we talk about the prevention of extremism, terrorism, and even organized and serious crime, we have to understand these phenomena and behaviors in a larger context in which there are less serious behaviors and attitudes that can reveal us important information about how and where and when we need to start prevention work. So these are the challenges. we are talking about. Cross-border cooperation between countries is, of course, a vast field. Most of what is advertised is about cooperation between governments and states. So just to give you a few examples, I'm sure you know the ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent and counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism, which is mainly about sharing capacity building for law enforcement, sharing information and intelligence between states, and enhance collaboration with international organizations. Civil society exists, yes, but it's in the background of this. Mostly cooperation between governments and states. Another example, the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, which Indonesia signed. Again, yes, civil society is somehow involved, private companies like Facebook are involved, but it's mostly about making sure that governments and online service providers consider appropriate actions to prevent the spread of violent content online. So again, cooperation between high-level organizations, not really between civil society. Similar thing for the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. Yes, civil society is invited. I have presented, I have seen many civil society organizations, even from Indonesia, involved, especially in the CDE working group. But still, the main players are governments. So I think we need to start thinking about and talking about cooperation between civil society actors in the prevention of violent extremism and terrorism. They can play, and we can play, a huge role. I'm talking about universities, international NGOs, local NGOs, religious organizations like, of course, ENU and Muhammadiyah, social enterprises, small businesses as well. There's a lot of push to create and work on creating small businesses to, let's say, fund and give financial sustainability to CDE and preventative work. Schools, research institutes and think tanks. So what can all these people do that governments cannot do to prevent violent extremism? Well, governments cannot do, or governments do badly. And actually civil societies do it much better. So first, education. Especially education that addresses communities and youth at risk of being recruited and radicalized. Usually government is not even allowed to enter those communities or is totally delegitimized. Civil society can enter. Challenging the appeal of hateful and extremist narratives. Governments, most of the times, and law enforcement agencies do not really have the legitimacy to do it. And also, I would like to ask you a point, and I will come back to it a bit later, but do you think it's correct that governments use taxpayers' money to counter ideas, maybe hateful ideas, that sometimes are part of the democratic process? So I'm thinking about Indonesia, for example, the Dua Satu Dua movement. Is it good that the government uses taxpayers' money to counter these ideas, which actually are ideas embraced and used and promoted by legitimate mainstream politicians? Is it a good use of taxpayers' money, or is it an ingerence on the political process? So actually, I think civil society is, again, the actor that can intervene and do something to counter these hateful narratives. And then, of course, early detection. Civil society organizations and members are the ones who see and talk to youth at risk, for example, and they're the ones who can gather intelligence and information to allow early detection and disruption of extremism or terrorist plots. Why does civil society do it better than governments? Well, I think the magic powers of civil society, let's say, are very clear and only a few. Trust and legitimacy, of course, and they are the same limitations as well. But they have trust and legitimacy among communities at risk. They are flexible. I'm sure we all have worked with governments, and government organizations are everything but flexible and ready to react. They are static and slow and gigantic. And they have freedom to take risks. I know a lot of government representatives who literally go out of the room when a former extremist speaks, because there is too much risk involved. What about if the former extremist commits recidivism or comes back to it, and then you find that a government agency funded someone who went back to terrorism? Well, governments usually are not really keen to take that risk. Civil society can, though, and they do great work with former extremists in prevention. So let's look at how this magic works in practice in terms of, for example, challenging hateful extremism. So we say that hateful extremism is about behaviors that incite or amplify hate. So behaviors that clearly are not criminal behaviors. There's no crime involved in most of the times. So if there is no crime, should the state or law enforcement intervene? Well, of course not. So, for example, of course, I know in Indonesia and in many countries there is legislation about hate speech, and it is criminalized, but only to an extent it is criminalized. Inciting violence is, in many countries. Things that are not a clear or explicit incitement to violence, not really, not always. So, what can we do in those cases? Well, I think that civil society can do a lot, and these cases are, let me tell you something very concerning. So, I'm taking the example after a conversation I had with John yesterday of El Paso, and which I'm sure maybe some of you remember. So, 3rd of August 2019, El Paso in Texas, a shooting in which 22 people were killed. The shooter published a manifesto online. The manifesto was full, if you read it, I did, of mainstream ideas that are totally accepted.
Dr. Matteo,
sorry?
We have 3 minutes.
Yes,
okay.
Totally accepted in mainstream politics. So it is important to understand that challenging these ideas is not something that governments can do, because it would be, again, intervening too much into the political debate. So again, civil society organizations can and have to enter and address these issues. Let me just make one note. What can we do to support civil society and cross-border cooperation between civil society organizations? Well, there are existing networks of academics and civil society organizations that we can empower. One of the projects I have been working on is a network called the Southeast Asia Networks of Civil Society Organizations working against violent extremism, and it has like over 60 members from Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. We share knowledge, we share lessons learned, and we share research, and we often invite academics. So we can definitely get involved in these initiatives, and please get in touch with me if you are interested. And we can try to develop mechanisms to promote trust between government and civil society organizations across borders. So, for example, one of the good initiatives of the Global Counterterrorism Forum is the promotion of national action plans. And in Indonesia, there is a process going on right now to create a national action plan about countering violent extremism, which wants to give a very important role to civil society organizations. Well, let's monitor these initiatives, and let's use Indonesia and understand how Indonesia can be a leader in the region, in other countries where national action plan discussion is only starting now, like Malaysia and Thailand. Well, and let's say apply lessons learned and successes and failures from Indonesia to other countries in the region. That's it. Thank you.